Welcome back to the second or the third session in a Christian approach to being with marginalized communities. So from what we've talked about already, it should be pretty clear that a Christian's heart should be out of imitation of Jesus. And so because of that, I'm going to let this slide speak for itself. So I'm going to read an overview of Jesus's attitude towards people. The lack of limit in what Jesus asks of people, the limitlessness of what he wants for people, washes away the difference between insiders and outsiders. He is never recorded as saying no to anyone. Anyone can claim his time if they can find a way through the crowd. And when someone does, whatever their reason is, he speaks to them as if the dust and the noise and the reaching hands had receded and nothing else were going on in the wide world, but he and they talking. All of his conversations seem to be personal. Jesus' sense of people is not additive. More is not better. Each person in front of him is, for that moment, the one missing sheep. And so, as Christians go forward, Christians are supposed to, this is what we're about, we should be imitating Jesus, looking toward the person with great hope for their potential, and also recognizing that no one has to do anything in order to be welcome, in order to be a part of anything. So we have this foundation of equal dignity and that we should care about everyone. And even though this is very difficult to accomplish, there is kind of a we know all that. And so the real question really comes in with, how does this get complicated? And what factors work against these ideas? And so we're going to be looking to Ibram Kendi's thought in his book, Stamped from the Beginning, to provide some context for how this can get complicated and for what things are working against these ideas. His book is a summary of racist ideas in the US, and he looks through the whole history of the United States in order to develop his thesis. And his thesis is that basically people, out of selfishness, or as he coins it, self-interest, pursue their interests. And then when they notice inequities as a result of that, those that are getting more then rationalize them getting more or them disenfranchising others and say, this is the way it should be. This is the way it's supposed to be. And so I'll give a quick example. So when Europeans landed in the Americas, there were millions of people living in the Americas, and due to a lot of different factors, the residents of Afro-Eurasia had exposure to many more diseases than those in the Americas. And so those from Europe brought these diseases to the Americas, not on purpose, but they brought them. And so through the course of the next many years, many Indians or Native Americans died or became very sick as a result of these diseases. Now, because of self-interest, the Europeans, rather than noticing hey, everyone is getting sick and dying, we should help, the response was usually the opposite. Rather, instead, we were meant to have this land. And there ended up being narratives kind of similar to Israel entering the promised land, rather than Jesus caring for the poor and those who need help. And so we see that this idea that the Europeans were supposed to conquer is a racist idea that was developed because of the self-interest, the desire for land and raw materials like silver, gold, potatoes, and more. This all came out of self-interest. and these racist ideas were meant to justify the inequities that were becoming apparent. And that kind of on down the line, what would develop would be a hatred or an ignorance of the other. And so basically, Ibram Kendi continues this by arguing that because it's grounded in self-interest, it's not, and the ideas are rationalizing that, it can be problematic to go at the ideas, partially because they tend to be recycled inversely from each other. So it'll go one way, and then it will go the other way, but it will still be racist and still be pursuing the self-interest of those in power, namely like the white group. And so I'll give a few examples, and in particular how Christianity and the Bible have been used to support racist ideas. So for instance, when the Portuguese and when the Spanish and when others found the heart of Africa, and when they also found the Americas, there was this question of whether there was a monogenesis, so a one genesis or beginning of humanity, or whether it was a polygenesis, or many beginnings. And one of the arguments would be that those that descended from Adam and Eve would have had this image-bearing characteristics, and those that came from others, if it was polygenesis, did not. And so you can see that if people argued from polygenesis, they'd be like, well, we don't need to treat these groups that we're finding as people because they don't share in the same image-bearing nature of God. And then later, or perhaps even at the same time, people say like, no, like all humans share in the common ancestry. We have one source. And then racism kind of came through that as well. There developed this curse of Ham, which is based on a very few lines in the Bible where after Noah lands with the ark, his son sees him naked, Ham, and that there's this curse that the sons of Ham would serve the other sons. And that this was then argued, even though they're brothers and would probably look somewhat similar to each other, that the sons of Ham were people from Africa and they were destined to serve the other brothers, and they argue that these would be the Europeans. And so this is obviously really shaky, really bad biblical argument, but you can see that both the argument that they're coming from the same source and from multiple sources tend to serve the status quo that the white people should continue to dominate both Africa and the Americas. And we see this as well in what was common at the time in the 1400s, 1500s, that it was stated that a Christian should not ever enslave a fellow Christian. And also, throughout history, there's been another push that, Christians should never enslave anyone. But at the time, this was common. And so then there was this problem, and I put problem in quotation marks, when many who were enslaved, whether they be Native Americans or Indians or Africans, became Christian. And the question was whether they needed to be freed. But Kendi points this out, that the argument still served self-interest, in that then the white oppressors would then argue, well, they have become Christian, but they became Christian because of our civilizing influence. And so it is better to be a Christian and a slave because you'll go to heaven than it is to be a non-Christian and free because you won't have been exposed to the gospel. Completely forgetting that, if you're a Christian, you're supposed to be being like Jesus. And so, as you can see, whether or not the Africans or the Indians or Native Americans were Christian or non-Christian, both arguments tended to serve the status quo, which was that the white oppressors were able to enslave the Indians, Native Americans, or Africans with impunity. And so we can see this happening, and it tends to be recycled throughout. And he argues that it's kind of like segregation or assimilation. Do people need to, as the argument goes, become like white people in order to be equal? Or do people need to be separated in order to flourish? And he argues that both of these arguments tend to support a white superiority rather than actual equity. So, as a result of his argument, he puts forward that because the racist ideas are argued as a result of self-interest based on inequities, that he argues that we should focus on changing policies and changing the status quo rather than on changing people's hearts and minds out of racist ideas. And I would argue that we can see the logic of this through something we've looked at before, through the elephant and the rider. That the rider would be the rational, forward-thinking, ability to make long-term ideas and conclusions part of our brain, and the elephant is our body and our subconscious. And basically, the elephant is geared towards accepting and rationalizing the status quo. And so essentially what he's arguing is we need to change the roads that we're going on so that way the elephant will go down better roads rather than trying to convince the rider to switch gears. That changing the roads, changing the policies, changing the culture will be more successful than trying to convince people to change their racist ideas, especially as he notes the recycling quality of racist ideas. And so, one of the things that he looks at here is, and one of the things that we should be aware of is that when we look at marginalization, it can come in three main forms. It can come individually, and this is what we normally expect, where someone is doing or saying something with the intent to marginalize or oppress a particular group. This usually has intent. This usually has a focus on it. And this tends to be the ones that our society right now would agree are wrong. And by the way, that is a good thing. But sometimes focusing only on the individual can mask not dealing with the others. Another one is cultural, where we have narratives, norms, standards, values, which validate and serve one group above others. So for instance, this could be in terms of what success looks like, what beauty looks like, what a good neighborhood looks like, and things like this, which can tend to kind of guide our elephants to valuing one group above others, even if it's not your group. That this can orient us to oppression. And kind of similarly, it could be institutional, where there are protocols, policies, and practices which validate and conserve one group above others. And so many people have pointed to, for instance, redlining, basically this policy of how to promote investment in banking and in housing, and this policy validated and served the white renters and landowners, and really underserved and oppressed those mainly black people and other minorities, other marginalized communities that lived in these redlined areas. So this would be an institutional form of marginalization. And so this is really important because normally when we think about morality, we focus on these three things. And I would argue that we still should generally focus on them. That when we're trying to determine whether something is right or wrong, we generally look at the intent, the object, and the circumstance. And the intent is what you're trying to do, and the object is what you're doing, and the circumstance is what else is going on. And one of the things that generally is the case when we look at cultural or institutional oppression or marginalization is that usually the intent is not there. So I'll give an example. So if you've ever been to the waterfront, there's that park there. That park on the west side in Portland used to be the highway. And this is a pretty common practice within American cities, but they moved the highway to the east side of the city, and you can see the I-5 corridor is right there. And that neighborhood that used to be there, because it wasn't always a freeway, was the traditional black neighborhood within Portland. And so the argument probably went something like, oh, they want to make this beautiful park, which arguably people would say like, hey, that's a nice thing. We should have more parks. Parks are good. Portland is a park city. This is great. And the goal is to build a highway for interstate transport and all these things. But you say like, that's a good thing. And they'd say like, well, we should move it to a place where the property values aren't as high, so that way it's cheaper. That way it's not going to burden the taxpayer. But the problem, the circumstances, the impact that's happening there is that you're disenfranchising a group which has been disenfranchised for hundreds of years. That there are reasons why this area's property values are lower. And that it's not just by accident, that it's also by design. And maybe not intentional design, but by design. And so these groups are displaced, and poor people tend to have less stability when they are forced to move. And so this can perpetuate these inequities. And so basically, one of the things we need to look at when we consider policies that might seem benign, like we need to build a highway, we need to look at the impact of these actions. And if these impacts are disproportionately affecting historically marginalized groups, we need to look back at them. That merely saying, I was trying to do the right thing isn't always good enough, because we need to look at the circumstances as well. Okay. So some last takeaways as we go forward through this is that one of the things to do, and to kind of come back to what we were talking about earlier, is that for Christians, and arguably for all people, we need to treat people as full people. And that when we look at the circumstances of our actions, we need to look at your history and the history of others with a goal of respect and responsibility, recognizing that that people tend to defend the status quo out of self-interest or protecting what people might already have. And oftentimes when people hear this, they might think some of these things that are down below, and I want to address them. That sometimes people, when they hear this, and I've actually heard this before, when people talk about equity, even around the school, it's that, is this just supposed to make white people hate themselves? And the goal is not to provoke hatred or guilt about your culture, background, ancestors, or family. People have pointed out that making the dominant culture hate itself doesn't really do anything. That generally, people in marginalized groups, they're like, we don't want you to just feel bad about yourself. We want equity. We want the resources, the opportunities that you have. We don't want you to hate yourself. And it's been pointed out that if you are focused on yourself and disliking yourself, that's still a focus on the self. It's not actually a focus on others. And so, kind of strangely, it's still self-centered. And so this is not the goal. And another thing that sometimes people will do is that in a desire to promote equity, there will be this like lifting up of marginalized cultures to an idealistic standard. And this is, I think, a helpful thing to recognize is that part of what we're realizing is that everyone is a full person. And so people can be good or bad in a variety of ways, and people are generally a mixed bag. And so there isn't like the hardworking people, or there isn't the good at math people. There isn't the soulful, good at music people. That people could be good at all of these things. They could struggle with all of these things. There isn't the people who are in line with spirituality and with nature. That human beings have the potential to be good at all of these things and could also be pretty bad at these things. And so when we hold up a culture in an idealized way that these people are good or should be good at this thing, this also serves marginalization. Another example is this third one, is that the goal is to focus on the people. And this is something that perhaps you run into, is that people sometimes valuing the marginalization. It's like, this group is valuable because this group has been oppressed. That the marginalization, the lack, is what is valuable. And that is not what is valuable. That marginalization, that being oppressed is not a culture in and of itself. There's a culture that comes out of that, but the people are what we should be focusing on, not focusing on valuing marginalization. It is not the oppression that is valuable. It is the people in spite of this oppression that are valuable. And I realize that some of these might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but I think these are really important to wrestle with. And so the last thing I want to leave you with, and I recognize that depending on where you are with this work, a lot of what I've said might be bringing up a lot of different things. And as I started this third or second part, was that with Jesus has so much that he wants for people, and at the same time, he has this universal access to himself. And so I leave us with some quotes from Matthew. When we look at the work, which is very difficult and also really important, that in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Be perfect or be whole as your heavenly Father is perfect or whole." This is the desire from God for us, that we would be whole. And this is part of the heart of why I'm in this work. And at the same time, Matthew 7:3, also part of the Sermon on the Mount. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? That it's very easy once people start shifting and be like, they move to self-interest and like, how can I use my knowledge about equity to start judging people who are doing worse at it than myself? This is not the heart behind this. The goal is to see each other and to move towards wholeness. And then kind of, if you do this work, I know for myself, there's this stress that comes about it. And oftentimes you don't really achieve much at the beginning. You just care about more and are stressed about more. And so this next quote, like, "Come to me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest." I know that sometimes when I do this work, I come away pretty uninspired, and I do feel this need to go to prayer in order to come back at it again another day. And then at the same time, this last quote, I need to remember the impact of my actions, that whatever I do to the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, I've done to Jesus, I've done to God. And that kind of all of these together really show like a Christian heart behind this work. I thank you so much for listening. I hope this was helpful to you. and I'll see you next time.